Now, could more be done to bring new drugs to patients with the most severe illnesses like cancer, Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, for instance? Every Tuesday, as you know, we take a good look at one particular area of healthcare. And today I'm asking about the process of finding and trialling new treatments and making sure that the right patients get to be part of the process. And most importantly, if it's a terminal illness, get to be part of the process at the right time. Cancer research says it can take between 10 and 15 years to develop a new treatment. So why is that? Why does it take so long, and could the process be faster? We'll also be exploring whether doctors should take more risks or be helped to take more risks when they try out new treatments. Thousands of UK scientists are working on new drugs and treatments every day, and the government-funded Medical Research Council spends around £759 million a year, and many more millions are spent by charities and drugs companies as well on research and development. We've been to meet two young scientists who work at the Northern Institute of Cancer Research. That's in Newcastle.
My name is Emily Mould. I'm a Cancer Research UK funded PhD student. I'm currently working on, I have some different types of leukemia. I have some kidney cancer and some colorectal cancer cells. So these cells were once in a patient, and we can now grow them in the lab and test different drugs on them to see how well they either slow down the growth of the cancer cells or how well they kill the cancer cells.
I'm Dr. Stephanie Myers. I completed my PhD last year. I then stayed on and I'm now completing my first postdoctoral position at the centre. I enjoyed my research so much that I felt like I wanted to see out the project which I'm working on, which is development of a new type of drug which is called a kinase inhibitor. A kinase is basically a protein inside the body, and several kinases in cancer have gone a little bit wrong. So what we can do with the drug molecule is inhibit, which means prevent the kinase from doing its job, and by doing that we can treat cancer cells.
When we're looking down the microscope, you can see the cells are sort of clumped together, so the cells like to grow close to each other, and then they sort of spread out across the bottom of the plate. So every cancer cell looks different down the microscope, which is how we sort of know what we're looking at, and they all have different properties. And then we can just look at these to see how healthy they are and whether they're ready to do our experiments with and things. These are tissue culture plates that have got 96 different wells in them. And then if we know how many cells we've got, we can put the same amount in each of these, and effectively we can do 96 different experiments just within this one plate. So it means that it's quite high throughput work. And this will happen over maybe like a week, that we can look at experiments here, and this will just show us how we can slow down the growth of the cancer cells.
Just sort of the act of developing a new drug can often take over 5 years, and that's because a drug doesn't just have to do the job against cancer, it also has to have a number of properties. So we not only need to know how the body reacts to the drug, we also need to know whether the drug is safe, whether it's absorbed into the stomach, which is something that we need. It needs to be able to get into cells. So there's several properties that need to be tuned. And the medicinal chemist's job is essentially a balancing act, which can take a very long time indeed.
It can be frustrating, but I think all the prosopan that we can use and we can treat cancer cells with, and then we'll go through the clinical and translational group, so it will go into the first patients and it will all be tested there. And at that point, it often gets handed on to we'll work closely with a drug company. But there's a lot of regulations that have to happen, but it's just to ensure that the drugs are really safe when they finally get to the patients and we know that they work. I think we're very lucky to work in a place like this. So this is one of the few places in the country where drugs can go right from the chemistry department through the biology testing and straight into the patients. And we're very lucky here that we have quite a lot of contact with the patients, and the patients can often come into the building and they can have a look round and they can come and talk to the scientists and really find out a little bit more about what we're doing now to advance cancer treatment.
Well, Janet Wisley is Chief Executive of the Health Research Authority. That's the body in charge of the regulations behind a new drug or treatment. Professor Andy Hall joins us too. He was until recently the Director of the Northern Institute of Cancer Research, where we've just heard from. And we can also speak to Tom Isaacs, who has Parkinson's disease. Good afternoon to all of you.
Good afternoon.
Some great work going on there, Professor Andy Hall, some talented, clever young people, and that their enthusiasm and their interest was great to hear, wasn't it? That's what you want in people doing research.
Absolutely. We've got a fantastic pool of people we can call on in this country. I think Emily and Stephanie really epitomises that for me. Young people working enthusiastically at a cause that they obviously regard as more than just a job. And I think also what they get a lot out of is meeting with patients, and that spurs them on. It's an extra incentive for them to do their work.
And Janet Wisely from the Health Research Authority. A little later in this hour, we're going to hear from a woman whose daughter died of cancer, despite a really big battle on her mother's part for her to take part in a trial, but she was a few weeks off her 18th birthday and was rejected. So it's very easy to, stamp your fist, bang your fist on the table in those instances and think, why weren't you? But in a sense, your organisation has some very tough decisions to make, doesn't it, about balancing securing the safety of patients in trials and making sure that research can be tested.
Yes, we're responsible for ethics committees that will be looking at studies and giving approval in the UK, and there will be difficult decisions to make. And also picking up on the early comments, it takes some time to understand that drugs are safe and that there is potential benefit. And in early phase trials, you really don't know that there is benefit, and you need to take that time to gather the evidence before you do involve potentially thousands of patients to determine that the drugs are effective and better than current treatments.
You'll be familiar with those who say, or the comments that people make about it still takes too long. You can be overcautious, that you can make doctors afraid of taking risks with treatments or even trying them for fear of litigation, and they need to be better supported in that. Is any of that true in your view?
In terms of research, then there is significant evidence that there's very little litigation in terms of people that have taken part in clinical trials, and that evidence has been gathered. I think that the challenge for the HRA, for the Health Research Authority, is to get more patients into more trials more quickly, and to get the NHS ready to set up those trials so that we do get that benefit. What
would facilitate that? What would make that easier?
Well, ethics committees are now one approval for the whole of the UK and work very effectively. So 96% of applications to an ethics committee get a positive response, and they're typically approved within 40 days.
96%, did you say? Yeah.
But our big challenge is that wherever you want to do research within the NHS, you need to get separate approvals at all of the different sites, and that's where we really should be much more efficient.
And when you talk about different sites, where do you mean? Do you mean
the hospitals, or whether you're being recruited through your GP? There's a whole layer of different approvals that the Health Research Authority is looking to bring into much more of a central process, so we can get much more efficient and much better. It is improving. The UK is getting better at getting the first trial sites up and running in the UK, but we need to get better at getting more sites up more quickly, so more patients have access to taking part in clinical trials.
And Tom Isaacs, I know that you've been frustrated by the system, both on a personal level and more widely than that. What's your objection to how it is at the moment? We heard Janet there describing how it might improve.
I think it's an issue which it's a system which governs the most important component of our living, which is our health, and yet it's controlled and funded by non-risk takers and people who have little concept of the levels of appropriate risk that people should take in any given situation. I think there should be more specificity on the control of ethics, because conditions are different, and I don't know how people can make decisions on different conditions without actually having those conditions.
Just respond to that, if you would, Janet, that without having those conditions you can't make decisions on it.
So ethics committees will be looking very much from the patient perspective and looking at issues that around the potential burden of the study on the individuals, potential benefits, potential risks, and in particular how those are described to participants. So quite generic issues around ensuring that if somebody is considering taking part, and it is all about access and choice and consent, that they're given all of the information they need to make that decision. Ethics committees would expect good funders stakeholders and sponsors of research to have done the patient public involvement before it gets to the ethics committee, so that they've assurance they're asking the right questions, that they've done the engagement with the particular research population to ensure that it is a well-designed study.
And essentially, you know, the conversation we're having is all about the how really a treatment goes from a lab successfully and quickly to the living room of somebody who has a condition, whichever condition we happen to be talking about. Now, Andy Hall, Professor Andy Hall, you're at the forefront at this kind of research. What are the problems from your point of view? Once you've researched something, you've researched a treatment in the lab and think, right, I think this can be applied now. How long does it take for that to be, you know, in the hands of a doctor treating a patient?
Yeah, it does take quite a long time. So you'll have heard from our researchers that they're identifying the Achilles heels that we are hoping to find within cancer. Cancer is turning out to be a very difficult disease to treat. It's a multi-headed monster with lots of abnormalities, but we've got lots of exciting new possibilities for drugs coming through. Unfortunately, many of those drugs don't make it because of chemical properties of the drugs themselves. So sometimes they're impossible to dissolve, for example. Brick dust is what's described as often in the lab. So we have delivery problems. Then, of course, we need to be absolutely sure that the drugs only kill the cancer and don't kill normal cells. So there's an extensive period of toxicology, which actually is normally done by our colleagues in the drugs industry. So I think all of that is always going to take a lot of time because it's a difficult process. Having said that, it's then quite frustrating to things to get a little bit choked up later on. And actually, I think from my point of view, as somebody who's worked in this field for a long time, I think it's something Tom said really struck home with me, and that is getting the balance between risk and benefit for the individual patient. I think it's very different if you're developing a new headache tablet. You've got to be absolutely sure that that's not going to cause an untoward side effect. If, on the other hand, you have a very serious medical condition like severe Parkinson's, like Tom has, or if you've got cancer, then a dialogue with the patient is really important to see if they're prepared to take something a little bit more of a risk, because it's only one time for them. And I think a lot of the debate really at the moment is about that as being potentially a holding block. I'm interested to hear what Janet was saying about that and the patient involvement being really important.
And Tom, we've talked about cancer and the research that was going on in that centre in Newcastle. The Northern Institute of Cancer Research was for cancer. How does Parkinson's fare in all of this in terms of new treatments and investigations into new treatments?
It's hugely frustrating. I know because I run a charity myself and we fund research, but the science is out there to do something incredible with Parkinson's, and yet we can't get it into the clinic. It seems to stall between the academic work and the commercial. You know, taking it between the academic universities where all the preclinical work takes place, and actually for the pharmaceutical companies to take the risk, to take the plunge, and to fork out on funding clinical trials in humans.
Yeah, you've talked about there being, it's a very stark description, a valley of death between the academic discoveries and making them a reality.
Yes, absolutely, and that is absolutely the case, and it's hugely frustrating when you know there are treatments out there and you can't get hold of them, and they're and there's another thing, which is that there's very little prioritisation of new drugs, so that the best drugs can't be brought forward, and there are several drugs which I'd love to bring forward because I think they're priorities in Parkinson's, and yet they have to go through the same rigour that everything else has to.
Well, Tom, thank you. Tom Isaacs, thanks very much indeed. We'll talk more with Professor Andy Hall, who was until recently the director of the Northern Institute of Cancer Research. We heard a little of the work going on there a few moments ago, and we'll hear more too from Janet Wisely, who's Chief Executive of the Health Research Authority. Let's get some weather. In this hour, though, we've been talking about the length of time it takes for a drug or a treatment for the very serious diseases like cancer and Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, for instance, to go from the lab to the patient, and what might get in the way way. The Conservative peer, Lord Saatchi, believes that some doctors fear being sued if a new treatment fails, so they don't try. He's been trying to change the law so that medics will be protected from litigation when they try innovative ideas. Last week, the government announced it would object to that bill. It's known as the Medical Innovation Bill. We'll hear from Maurice Saatchi shortly, but first, Debbie Binner's daughter, Chloe, died of cancer when she was 18. Chloe was refused a place on a clinical trial because she was 3 months off her 18th birthday. Debbie told me yesterday when I spoke to her how the family began trying to get Chloe the drug that might have helped her.
As you do as a parent, I spent literally kind of every night for 3 years researching Ewing sarcoma. There's not much about Ewing sarcoma I don't know about. And we came across this drug that was called a PARP inhibitor, which is being used in ovarian and breast cancer very successfully. So we went and saw, we saw our own consultant. We also went and saw a consultant that worked in one of the big American hospitals, and they both agreed that this is the drug that Chloe should have. You can imagine just how horrified we were when, despite having support from absolutely everyone, nobody was saying that this isn't a drug Chloe shouldn't have, including the people at the Royal Marsden. And we just couldn't get them to shift. We fought tooth and nail the whole way. The energy it took was enormous. It just seemed a complete mess, the whole process. But eventually, we actually got the chief executive to intervene, and we did get the drug. But by that time, she was really, really poorly. And I think any of the doctors will tell you that by the time somebody is that poorly with cancer, nothing's going to work. So we felt we'd kind of missed that golden opportunity. And she only took the drug, I think, for about a week before she got very, very poorly and was actually unable to swallow the drug then. So, she died a couple of weeks later.
And I suppose that, added to just the awful loss of losing your child, you've got that question mark, haven't you, about what might have been?
It seemed a system that wasn't working, that had no common sense, and that was just kind of cruel to patients and families. An illness like my daughter has, which does tend to affect children and young people, with all those years ahead of them, the outcomes haven't changed in 30 to 40 years. And you hear about all these new treatments that are coming up. And actually, one of the professors at the Marsden told me yesterday that this is a golden age for cancer development and the drugs that are coming up. And I think he understood how difficult that was to say to somebody like me. But unless we get this system right, unless we get these drugs, a system where drugs can come through more freely and that people can get access to them, it's going to carry on.
But you do understand, don't you, that it has to be regulated, and it has to be regulated in a sense by people who aren't affected at that moment, who aren't emotionally involved in the way that you and any parent inevitably would be.
Absolutely. And that's why I'm carrying on talking about it now. And that's why I want to carry on campaigning, because I can't bring my daughter back. So I have no kind of vested interest at the moment. And I really agree with Maurice Saatchi when he said that grief or even the trauma of that doesn't mean to say you haven't got a valid point. Looking back, I feel more and more passionate about it. And it absolutely breaks my heart that another parent would have to go through what we went through, not just by having a sick child, but by this idea that people don't really roll their sleeves up and think, actually, we're going to do everything to try and make this child better. Because instead what we faced was just block after block.
Well, the American drug company BioMarin ran the trial that Debbie mentioned that her daughter wasn't allowed to take part in, and they've sent us this statement about Chloe's case.
Our deepest sympathy goes out to the parents who are grieving the loss of their child. It is precisely because of patients who suffer from devastating rare genetic diseases that BioMarin develops therapies where there are few, if any, options. Ewing's sarcoma is a terrible, aggressive disease, and we hope to make a difference in this type of outcome. We are conducting a Phase 1, Phase 2 trial in several genetically defined cancers. Not only is this an early-stage trial, but it is the first clinical trial that we've ever done with this therapy. It is premature to know if it is safe or effective. BioMarin is committed to doing what's in the best interests of patients with rare genetic diseases by delivering first-in-class or best-in-class therapies approved by the regulatory agencies as quickly as possible. To change the course of horrible diseases like genetically defined cancers, we must carefully conduct clinical research to establish the safety and efficacy of our approach. We do not want the development process to take longer than necessary by skipping important steps. Our goal is to deliver therapies as quickly and safely as possible that will make a big difference in the lives of the small number of patients suffering from serious or rare orphan diseases.
And that was the statement from BioMarin. Janet Wisely is still with us from the Health Research Authority, and Professor Andy Hall is as well. We're joined by the Conservative peer, Lord Saatchi, whose bill, the Medical Innovation Bill, we were talking about just a moment ago. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
Your wife's death led you to putting your energies into this in a big way, in a very public way. Has your grief proved to be the great motivator on this?
Well, I think I couldn't put it better than what you just heard from Debbie. Grief is not necessarily a disqualification from rational thought. So the rational thought I'd offer your listeners is that, which I think is painful to hear, is that all cancer deaths are wasted lives. I don't mean in the sentimental sense that if only this daughter, mother, sister, brother, whatever it is, if only they'd gone on to fulfill their potential in the world, wouldn't that be... I don't mean that at all. I mean in the strictly mathematical, scientific sense that science did not advance by 1 centimetre as a result of all these cancer deaths. The reason for that is that the deceased received only the standard procedure. The reason for that is that the law defines medical negligence on the part of the doctor in a particular way, which is that the doctor must stick to the well-worn path of the status quo. Because if the doctor steps aside from that path, he or she is likely to be found guilty of medical negligence, even though the doctor knows that the standard procedure leads only to poor life quality followed by death.
Do you believe that of all cancers? I mean, there may be women listening, for example, who have been successfully treated for breast cancer, who 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, wouldn't have survived it because of research, because of development. There are bright spots in all of this, aren't there?
Yes, and it's not necessary for me to say that there aren't bright spots and that there aren't people doing marvellous work, and I take my hat off to all of them. On the other hand, they would, as readily as I agree with them, they would readily agree with me that so far as many cancers are concerned, this is a disease which is relentless, remorseless, merciless, and its treatment is medieval, degrading and ineffective. And I don't know whether you would be able to find a doctor who disagreed with that picture of cancer, because it is the real one in most cancers.
Let me bring in Professor Andy Hall on that last point you made. He was the former director of the Northern Institute of Cancer Research. It's fair to say, isn't it, Andy Hall, that chemotherapy, whilst it works in many instances, is a very blunt instrument?
Indeed, and I applaud Lord Saatchi's efforts into bringing this to everybody's attention. Standard chemotherapy has been around for 30 or 40 years. The drugs to which Lord Saatchi refers are indeed totally barbaric in many cases. The fact is they do work on occasions, and we have patients listening, I'm sure, who are going through that chemotherapy at the moment who will understand what I'm talking about. So what we need to do is to move away towards more targeted and more effective therapies. And I think one of the frustrations I have is that we're not getting drugs quickly enough through the clinical trials such that we can discard ones that aren't going to help us and move on to ones that are. So absolutely agree with what Lord Saatchi says about the need to get on with it in terms of trying these new agents out. I think if you've got effective drugs, you can find out that they work pretty quickly. And the analogy I draw here is with penicillin. My father was in the Second War. He told me that when penicillin came in, every soldier that had it survived, and every soldier that didn't died with an infection. And what we need are drugs like that in cancer, and there have been 1 or 2 examples. So chronic myeloid leukemia, for example, there's a drug called imatinib, which works exactly that effectively. And what we would like is more to do with the sorts of tumours that affect the majority of people who present with cancer.
And let me ask Janet Wisely before we hear more from Maurice Saatchi. Janet Wisely, Chief Executive of the Health Research Authority. Do you agree with what Lord Saatchi was saying there a moment ago about the obstacles that might be in the way of doctors carrying out research and wanting to use treatments? Do you believe that that's part of the work that your body should be doing to loosen up those, to remove those obstacles, to loosen up practice?
I think that where innovation is experimental, that it should be part of a clinical trial, because I would want that experimental nature to be, one, transparent, so that people knew that it was going on and there would be a wider learning, so that there was some control about the evaluation. So I think that we do need to support innovation, but we need to be careful to make sure that we also are gathering that evidence and that it's transparent. And I think that Andrew Hall is correct, that we really have got to get more people onto clinical trials more quickly, so that we're determining what drugs are effective and we're determining what ones that should be moving to licence more quickly as well.
And Lord Saatchi, that the government announced last week, for people who aren't aware, that it would object to the bill that you wanted brought into law. The Department of Health have told us they welcome the open debate on how to encourage innovation, but the system currently does not prevent doctors from doing their best. My guess is that you would totally disagree with the second part of that statement.
Well, yes, I mean, on the advice that we've had in relation to the bill, I know that the Department of Health doesn't agree with what I'm going to say, because the Department of Health takes the view that the bill is unnecessary because there is innovation now. Doctors can innovate. There's no fear of litigation. So therefore they think the bill is unnecessary. Well, we obviously hope to persuade them that to change that view, and I'm actually highly confident that we will. But the point that was just being made, which I think is a very good one, is that we can't have a situation, and I don't want any of your listeners to misunderstand this. We can't possibly have a situation in which patients are being treated like mice. We can't have a situation in which doctors are allowed to recklessly experiment on patients in a way that could do them serious harm. So this bill does not seek to give doctors the freedom to do whatever they want. That would be dangerous. And so the bill takes its cue from two other acts of Parliament, the Abortion Act and the Mental Health Act, where Parliament takes the view that these are so serious, sectioning somebody in a mental institution or carrying out an abortion, that one doctor's authorization alone is not sufficient, and that two doctors' authorizations are required. So the bill takes that as its cue, if you like, and it goes a lot further by saying that before an innovation can be put to the patient, as it must be, to receive the patient's consent, it must be approved. This is what the bill says. It must be approved, the proposed innovation, by the multidisciplinary team in the hospital, which exists in all hospitals and deals with all cancer cases. That the MDT, as it's called, must approve the proposed innovation in advance. That the proposed innovation must be reported to the doctor's senior responsible officer. All doctors now do have in their validation procedure such a senior person. And that therefore that safeguard is in place to prevent a situation in which, as I said, patients are just being experimented on.
Is part of what you describe also a means of protecting doctors who are trying things out, and again, not in a vacuum and not in secret, I understand that's the nature of what you're suggesting, that they are protected from inevitable failures when trying new things?
Well, you're so right, because what goes on at the moment, and the Department of Health doesn't agree with this, so let's give them credit. They say doctors don't have a fear of litigation, and therefore all this is unnecessary. Well, maybe that's right. So far as I've been able to observe, and we've had tremendous advice from the top levels of the judiciary and the top levels of the medical profession. Let's put it this way: if a doctor sticks to the standard procedure, they will be safe if something goes wrong, because that's what the law says. I'll explain it more if you want. If the doctor considers stepping outside the standard procedure, what is absolutely beyond doubt is that a red light goes on in front of them, and that they then know that if something goes wrong, there will be a trial, and in the trial, expert witnesses will be called for the prosecution and the defence. What these expert witnesses are testifying about in law is, did the doctor or did the doctor not follow the standard procedure? If he did, he's innocent. If he didn't, he's guilty.
So you're not suggesting for a second that responsibility for individual doctors' sense of proportion and appropriateness is lost in all of this?
No, I think that's absolutely essential. And let me make this point too. Some people at the Department of Health think that all that matters is that the patient gives consent. But the judges that we've consulted do not believe that's the case, because the law takes the view that it's for the doctor to be responsible. It's not for the patient, who's probably very weak, or for the relatives, who are probably very distressed.
And desperate sometimes.
Desperate, as you just heard. It's not so the courts aren't really impressed by whether the patient signed the consent form or whether they didn't. The consent form is not an immunity from prosecution for the doctor, and that's, I think, quite right.
You said a moment ago that you believe you can convince the Department of Health and others, I guess, to come back on board or to look again. How are you going to go about that?
Well, I might start by sending them all a copy of the Prime Minister's Life Sciences speech. I'm sure they pay tremendous attention to what the Prime Minister says around at the Department of Health. And he said in that very important speech that he described his dream his vision for the NHS. And I'm quoting exactly. He says what he wants is every clinician a researcher. And he also goes on to say, every willing patient a research patient. Well, that's a marvellous vision. It's exactly the vision of this bill, but the Prime Minister cannot achieve his vision under current law. This law will have to change in order for what he wants to happen. And I think he knows that. So that's why I feel rather confident.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us on this. And just a final thought on what Maurice Saatchi's been saying from Professor Andy Hall on this and Janet Wisely.
Yeah, as I said before, I really applaud Lord Saatchi's bill and what he's trying to do here, particularly from my perspective in just emphasising the last points that he made, really, which was that we want to have a very research-orientated National Health Service. We've lost sight of that a little bit. And I think particularly for these intractable diseases, and cancer doesn't have a monopoly of this, it must be said, we need patients to feel part of the pathway, really, as stakeholders in the whole process. So listening to their voices, encouraging their participation, and making them, as I say, an equal partner in this endeavour is really important to me, and that's the part that I find so uplifting.
Janet Wisely.
Yes, I agree. I mean, the NHS Constitution makes it clear that as a patient in the NHS, you can expect to be asked to participate in research, and we do need to make that a reality.
We're going to talk in a moment about where the pharmaceutical companies fit into all of this. And if you can stay till 1, that would be great to both of you, Janet Wisely and Professor Andy Hall. Just before we get the travel news, let me tell you that Shree Ndawani, who's suspected of arranging the murder of his wife on honeymoon in South Africa, has won another High Court hearing in his legal battle against extradition to South Africa. More on that when we have it. Here's Orna.
OK, well, if you're heading into Hull city centre, on the A63 Clive Sullivan Way on the eastbound side, the road is partly blocked. It's all following an accident. It happened between St Andrews Quay and Daltrey Street flyover. And in Stoke-on-Trent, Stoke Road is closed. That's all for emergency repairs, but it's affecting traffic between Station Road and the D Road, the A500. Orna Merchant, 5 Live Travel.
Let me just tell you that Downing Street has now confirmed that the go-home vans we were talking about a moment ago to encourage illegal immigrants to leave Britain are indeed to be scrapped. The spokesman for Number 10 said there will be no further rollout of the pilot. It was a pilot scheme that caused the furore in the first place. The vans originally piloted in 6 London boroughs but faced criticism, including from, among others, the Deputy Prime Minister and the Advertising Standards Authority.
Formula One. Across the BBC.
The Japanese Grand Prix. He's going to take the checkered flag. It's a victory, his 4th in 5 years. Sebastian Vettel is now just a few points away from his 4th World Championship.
It means that if Vettel finishes in the top 5 in India, he'll win the championship no matter what anybody does.
Next,
the Indian Grand Prix.
Live race commentary is on BBC Radio 5 Live and BBC One from 9:30 a.m. on Sunday.
Well, we've been hearing since midday about the length of time it takes from when a new drug or treatment is initially discovered to it being available to patients with some of the most serious diseases that we know. One vital step in the process of making a drug available to the wider public is, of course, the investment and backing of pharmaceutical companies. Stephen Whitehead is the Chief Executive of the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry. That's the trade association for the research-based pharmaceutical industry. Good afternoon to you, Stephen.
Good afternoon.
They often hold the key to the door, really, don't they, when it comes to the development of a drug?
Well, 90% of medicines available in the world today were discovered, developed and launched by the pharmaceutical industry. So we have played an enormous role in terms of improving contemporary healthcare and improving the well-being of patients. We confront exactly the same issues that you've been talking about for the past hour, which is really about the cost of development. It's about, on average, it's about £1 billion to discover, develop and manufacture and get that medicine to a patient.
Is it always about cost, or is it sometimes about willingness? You know, Lord Saatchi was talking there about the willingness to look sideways and innovate rather than forward and just do what we always have.
It's a very good challenge from Lord Saatchi, and we do support his initiative. In fact, I think anything that encourages research and awareness of research and people's willingness to get involved is very important. It's beholden upon my industry to make that research and development process as efficient as possible. Fundamentally, cost is an issue because you have to go through phase 1, animal studies, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials, and then a regulatory process, and that does cost about £1 billion and can take up to 12 years. But there are opportunities that are available within the current regulatory mechanisms where you can optimise, if you like, the existing flexibilities. So including early access schemes for drugs in phase 2, sometimes early access drugs in phase 1 if you've demonstrated efficacy before you go to a license. So certainly, and compassionate use programs as well, where we're exploring the concept of adaptive licensing, which again looks at repurposing current medicines for other uses that are currently on the market. Particularly that's the case in cancer. So
a drug that's worked in cancer might coincidentally work in another one and just be given to that patient because it's already tested.
It's exactly. You've been through certain test procedures already on the quality side and certainly on the safety side. What you haven't been through is the efficacy in that particular type of cancer.
Well, I wanted to ask you about safety because I wonder whether the industry, not just the medical profession, we're talking there about the fears that some doctors may have of litigation. What about the pharmaceutical industry? Are they frightened of another thalidomide?
No, I think that thalidomide clearly was the early 1960s, and on the basis of that there was a huge reforming of the regulatory system. It turned the regulatory system on its head, quite rightly. That was a pretty awful episode. Those things could not happen again in that way. You have to fundamentally accept, of course, that any medicine is a poison. It's best not to take any medicine unless you absolutely have to. The secret is balancing the benefit and the risk. What is the benefit of taking the medicine versus the risk of taking it? And in some of these horrible intractable diseases we're confronting now, that benefit and that risk needs to be rebalanced. So we accept people are prepared to take a higher risk for the benefit because there are no other treatments available for that particular disease.
Thank you, Stephen Whitehead, Chief Executive of the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry. And thanks again to Janet Wisely, who's been with us for the past hour, Chief Executive of the Health Research Authority. That's the body in charge of regulations behind any new drug or new treatment. And thanks to Professor Andy Hall, who was until recently the Director of the Northern Institute of Cancer Research. And to Lord Saatchi as well for speaking to us about the Medical Innovation Bill.